Hello, everyone, and welcome to another week of our Sunday reading reflections. This week we are looking at the 23rd Sunday of Ordinary Time, and we're going to actually look at all three readings this week, just because they're all really good. I'm not saying that the other weeks that readings weren't good, but they're all sort of connected to each other. The first reading and the Gospel are connected to each other because Isaiah is prophesying about the Messiah, talking about how the Messiah will open up the ears of the deaf, help the blind see, help the mute speak. And in the gospel reading, we have Jesus here. He is approached by a deaf man who has an impediment in speech. And this man and his friends are saying, please, please heal him. And what Jesus does, he does heal them. He does heal the man. But he does it in a very special way. He doesn't just say, be healed, and he's healed. He takes his fingers, he touches his ears, touches his tongue. It's a very physical aspect to how he is healing this man. And if we think about the sacraments are also done in a very physical way, um, whether it be with oil, water, laying on of hands. The Eucharist obviously is the body and blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus in the presence of um, the Eucharist that we receive, and we consume the Eucharist. And we have this very physical aspect to the sacraments, regardless of which sacrament it is. And when we look at this, it really is pointing us to something, because we as people are body and soul. We interact with the world through our bodies, and God doesn't just leave us with the whole spiritual reality that's completely separate of the physical. He comes to us and he gives us the sacraments. He gives us a physical nature to the spiritual reality. And we see this in the incarnation, where the Word of God becoming flesh in Jesus. And here Jesus is healing the man by physical touch. And this is a beautiful thing, because Jesus is not afraid to get down and dirty with us. He's not afraid to reach out and touch us. And when we let Jesus into our life, spiritually, physical things can change. Healings do happen, just like we see here in Jesus' time. And this is why it's also important for us to continue to go to the sacraments, because we have this physical encounter with God through the sacraments, especially through confession and the Eucharist. In confession, we meet Jesus in the person of the priest. He is in persona Christi, so in the person of Christ. So we come face to face, or maybe it's through a screen, but there's still the physical presence of the priest who's in persona Christi. And at Mass, we receive the Eucharist. So these are very physical ways that we can interact with God, and this is where the sacraments really come into play. But here in the Gospel, we have Jesus physically healing this man, touching his ears, touching his tongue. He's healed. The people also recognize how this is connected to the prophecy that Isaiah has about the Messiah, but healing all these things. And they recognize that through this, that Jesus is the Messiah. And they really want to know more. And this is how our hearts should be open to learning more about Christ, whether it's through listening to the Gospels at Mass, picking up a Bible, reading the Gospels, but also not being afraid to look into the Old Testament, because there's so much about Jesus in the Old Testament. Like this part from Isaiah, we have prophecies from the different prophets pointing to Jesus. When we learn more about that, that is where we can really start learning how to live like Christ. And here in this in the gospel, in the letter of James, we have James talking to the assemblies of people. He's saying, he's basically asking, are you treating the rich and poor the same? And he talks about how, whether or not, like, if a rich man comes in with fine clothes, rings, do you give them preferential treatment? And then do you turn around to the poor in your assembly and tell them to stand off to the side or sit at your feet and just basically treat them lesser than you? And this really is something that we need to take into account for how we interact with people at Mass. Are we shunning people who we think might be different than us or don't look necessarily as prepared to come to Mass, even though we don't know their spiritual disposition? We might just be judging based off of physical appearance. I know from personal experience how, especially the first years in university, some of the years I worked all day for the opening of the residence, and when you're outside all day working in the hot sun, you don't look good, you don't smell good. And I didn't have time one of those years to take a shower and get dressed. I had just enough time to hop on the final bus off of campus and get down to the church. And when I got down to the church, these people saw how I was clearly wearing residence clothing, and they welcomed me in. It's like, oh, you must have been working really hard at the university. Glad you were able to make it to church. And it was such a beautiful response where people were just letting me in and not treating me poorly because of how I was dressed and how I probably looked. But other times I've had opposite experiences where I've been working outside all day, cutting grass at a cemetery, and I showed up in my work clothes because I didn't have time to go home and get changed. And this was during an evening mass during the week. And so people kind of like, you can't come in here. Like, oh, I want to receive the Eucharist. I want to come to Mass. And they just weren't really happy with how I was dressed and how I looked. Just because I was covered in dirt, grass, and I mean, I tried to brush as much off as possible. But then that was a completely different feeling. I didn't necessarily feel welcomed. I still stayed. But when we treat people like that, when we look at someone coming into Mass and treat people differently based off of how they might look, we don't know it all the time. We don't know where they're coming from. Who knows? Someone could be on a walking pilgrimage by themselves and has been walking for 20 kilometers that day, and you're their parish that they're stopping off at to have Mass. And we don't know this. So this is what James is sort of talking about. Not to just treat people based off their appearance and how we might think their social standing is. James is telling us to make sure we're welcoming everyone into the assembly, so everyone into Mass. And I know from St. John's, from experience at St. John's, ever since I was started off as youth minister, I've always feel welcomed, and I always see people welcoming new people coming in. And this is such a beauty of being part of that community. And it's encouraging us to remind ourselves that even whether it be at Mass or in our daily lives, to really challenge ourselves not to just dismiss people who we may not necessarily feel are, I don't want to say necessarily worth our time, but like I know sometimes I fall into that where I'm like, oh well, I'm busy. Like, can you just go talk to someone else? And I know I fall into that, and I need to work on that. So maybe this is how James is telling us to really work on ourselves, that we welcome people into with our lives, into our Mass, just being able to be that welcoming presence for people. And this is really, especially for people who are new to church or haven't been back to church in a while, this can be a huge game changer. This can be a huge game changer of whether or not they feel welcomed by the church. And sometimes I fail at that where I'm not the most welcoming. Other times I try my best. And that's really what we're all being called to do. To try our best to be like Jesus. And this is what James is calling us to do. This is why Jesus came to us. Jesus came down in a physical form, with a body. Jesus became man, and he touched us with his sacraments. And this is what it means to be Catholics, where we reach out to those who society may reject and bring them in and welcome them. So until next week, until we are able to talk again about the readings, I want to wish you a really happy week, joyful week. And until we meet again, know that I am praying for you. Please pray for me, and God bless. Bye.